You picture a silent night. That is the image that has been carefully curated for you over centuries of art and song. You see a stable bathed in soft ethereal light, surrounded by snow that never falls in Judea, watched over by shepherds who would never be in the fields in the dead of winter. It is a tableau of perfect, serene peace. But this image is a mask. If you were to actually transport yourself back 2,000 years to the specific date of December 25th, you would not find silence. You would not find a humble adoration scene. You would step into a world screaming in a chaotic, drunken, and terrified frenzy. You would find streets running with the blood of bulls and the wine of emperors. You would find a civilization gripping the edge of sanity because they believed the sun itself was dying. You probably believe that Christmas is simply the observed birthday of Jesus of Nazareth, a date chosen for its historical accuracy. The archaeological and astronomical data suggests this is impossible. But here is what is truly fascinating. The date was not chosen by accident, nor was it chosen at random. It was a tactical military maneuver in a war for the human soul. The rituals you perform, hanging the greens, lighting the candles, gathering in the warmth, were not originally designed to celebrate a birth. They were desperate, ancient magic spells cast to ensure the return of the light. The story of this date is not about a manger. It is about the collision of forgotten empires and the fear of the dark. Let me show you the history that was buried beneath the snow. You're watching The Myth Weaver, where shadows whisper the truth. To understand the reality of this season, we must first strip away the modern comfort we associate with winter. Today, winter is a nuisance, a season of high heating bills and slippery roads. To the ancients, to the people of the lost civilizations who laid the foundations of our calendar, winter was a metaphysical threat. As the year aged, the sun, the literal engine of life, the god that grew the grain and warmed the flesh, began to retreat. The days grew short, the shadows lengthened, the nights became long, cold, and filled with predators. This was not merely a change in weather, it was a cosmic crisis. There was a pervasive, primal fear that gnawed at the mind of early man. What if the sun does not come back? What if this time the darkness wins? This fear is the root of the winter solstice, the shortest day and the longest night of the year. In the northern hemisphere, this astronomical event falls around December 21st or 22nd. It is the hinge upon which the world turns. For the ancients, this was the moment of maximum danger. The sun had reached its lowest point on the horizon. It appeared to stand still for 3 days, a celestial pause that held the breath of the world captive. If the rituals were not performed, if the fires were not lit, if the sacrifices were not made, the sun might simply slip below the edge of the world and leave humanity to freeze in eternal twilight. This is the atmosphere into which we must descend. It is not a time of joy, but a time of desperate bargaining with the forces of nature. And nowhere was this bargaining more loud, more violent, and more violent than in the heart of the Roman Empire. Long before the star rose over Bethlehem, Rome was celebrating the Saturnalia. If you want to find the DNA of our modern Christmas, you do not look to the scriptures, you look to the temple of Saturn in the Roman Forum. Saturn was an old god, a titan of agriculture, time, and liberation. Legend said that long ago, he had ruled over a golden age where the earth gave up its bounty without labor, where men lived in peace, and where slavery did not exist. The Saturnalia was an attempt to magically recreate that lost paradise, if only for a few days. Beginning on December 17th and exploding through the week, Rome turned itself upside down. This was the festival of misrule. The strict, iron-fisted social order of the empire was suspended. The courts were closed. War could not be declared. Business ceased. In the flickering light of beeswax candles, the ancestors of your Christmas lights, the world went mad. Slaves wore the clothes of their masters and were served dinner by the men who owned them. Gambling, usually forbidden, was rampant in the streets. The greeting Io Saturnalia echoed off the marble walls, a shout of defiance against the coming dark. But beneath the feasting and the gift-giving, there was a jagged edge. The reversal of order was a dangerous game. To maintain the balance, a king of the Saturnalia was often chosen. A mock ruler presided over the chaos, giving absurd orders that had to be obeyed. In the darker, older versions of the myth, this mock king represented the old year, the scapegoat who took on the sins of the people. At the festival's end, the fun stopped. The order had to be restored. The shadow of sacrifice always loomed behind the laughter. This was the energy vibrating through the ancient world. It was a season of fire against ice, of life riotously asserting itself in the face of death. But Saturn was not the only deity claiming the winter. As the empire expanded, its legions marched into the east, and they brought back something else, a soldier's god, a deity of rigid hierarchy and blinding light. They brought back Mithras, and they brought back the cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. By the 3rd century, the Roman Emperor Aurelian established the festival of Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, the birthday of the unconquered sun. The date chosen for this celebration was December 25th. This was the moment the sun was perceptibly seen to be returning, the moment the days began to lengthen again. It was the victory of light over darkness. The temples were ablaze. The legions swore loyalty to the solar disk that could not be defeated. This date, December 25th, was already the most holy, the most charged, and the most culturally immovable date in the Roman calendar. It was the climax of the winter festivities. It was the heartbeat of the empire. Now, consider the position of the early church. They were a small, persecuted sect navigating a world dominated by these colossal pagan festivals. They had a problem. The scriptures gave no date for the birth of their Messiah. In fact, the internal evidence of the texts argued against winter entirely. The Gospel of Luke describes shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. In Judea, the flocks were brought in from the fields by October to protect them from the cold and rain. A December birth was historically inconsistent and logistically improbable. Furthermore, early Christian theologians weren't even interested in birthdays. Birthdays were pagan customs. The church focused on the date of death and resurrection. But as the religion grew, it needed to compete for the attention of the masses. It needed to offer an alternative to the roaring fires of Saturnalia and the golden allure of Sol Invictus. You cannot simply tell a population to stop celebrating the return of the sun. The urge is too deep, too biological. You cannot erase the festival, but with enough time and enough cunning, you can rename it. The choice of December 25th was a stroke of psychological genius. It allowed the church to co-opt the existing infrastructure of celebration. The candles lit for Saturn became candles for the light of the world. The evergreen branches brought inside to house the spirits of the forest became symbols of everlasting life. The gifts exchanged for luck became gifts in honor of the Magi. They did not destroy the old world. They built a cathedral on top of it, using the same stones. But when you build on top of ruins, the ghosts remain in the basement. The transition was not smooth, and the old gods did not go quietly. The folklore of this season is littered with the remnants of what was suppressed. Strange figures that haunt the periphery of the Christmas story, dark companions to the gift giver, and rituals that smell of old blood. To understand what really happened, we have to look at the entities that were evicted from the solstice and how they clawed their way back in. One of the most persistent of these evicted tenants is the shadow of the saint himself. We are conditioned to see the figure of the gift giver as purely benevolent, a grandfatherly presence radiating warmth and generosity. But in the older, darker currents of European folklore, light never exists without a shadow. For centuries, Saint Nicholas did not travel alone. He was accompanied by a figure that represented the harsh reality of the winter solstice, a creature that has been sanitized and nearly forgotten by the modern commercial machine. This is the Krampus, the horned, cloven-hoofed enforcer who carried birch branches not for decoration, but for punishment. While the saint rewarded the obedient, the Krampus dealt with the wicked. This duality was essential to the ancient mindset. The winter was not just a time of feasting, it was a time of judgment. The survival of the tribe depended on social cohesion and resource management. If you were wasteful, if you were wicked, you endangered the collective during the famine months. The Krampus was the monstrous manifestation of that fear. He was the beast man, a remnant of the horned gods of the forest, allowed to walk the earth for one night to balance the scales. The church tried to ban the Krampus processions, branding them as devil worship, but the people refused to let him go. He was too necessary. He explained why the winter felt predatory. But the Krampus is merely the most famous of the dark companions. Dig deeper into the alpine valleys and the frozen forests of the north, and you find entities far more terrifying, remnants of a civilization that viewed the solstice as a spiritual battlefield. Consider the figure of Frau Perchta. In the Germanic traditions, she was a dual-faced goddess, beautiful as the driven snow, or haggard as a corpse. She roamed the countryside during the 12 days of Christmas, specifically looking for those who had left their work unfinished. Perchta was the enforcer of cultural taboos. If a spinner had not finished her flax, or if a house was not swept clean for the holy days, Perchta would not leave coal. The legend states she would slit the bellies of the lazy, remove their innards, and replace them with straw and pebbles. This visceral imagery speaks to a time when laziness meant death. In the deep winter of the Iron Age, if you did not work, you did not eat, and your family starved. Perchta was the nightmare that kept the spinning wheels turning when exhaustion set in. She is a perfect example of how a survival mechanism was encoded into a monster, a myth designed to keep a civilization alive through the darkest nights. As we move further north, the darkness of the season takes on a different shape. In Iceland, the folklore speaks of the Jólakötturinn, the Yule Cat. This is not a house pet. It is a giant beast that towers over the snowdrifts, prowling the frozen landscape on Christmas Eve. The Yule Cat hunts for those who have not received new clothes before the festival. On the surface, this sounds like a trivial superstition about fashion, but strip away the whimsy and you find the brutal economics of the ancient North. To get new clothes meant the household had successfully processed the autumn wool. It meant the sheep had been sheared, the wool carded, spun, and woven. It meant the work was done. Those who had no new clothes had failed in their duties. The Yule Cat didn't just eat the lazy, it ate the unproductive. It is a terrifying metaphor for the elements themselves. The cold does not care if you are a good person. It only cares if you are prepared. The Yule Cat is the embodiment of hypothermia, a monster that consumes those who are not insulated against the frost. These entities, Krampus, Perchta, the Yule Cat, are the fragmented memories of the wild hunt. This is perhaps the most potent of all the forbidden myths, the root from which the modern concept of Santa's sleigh grows. Long before the invention of the red suit, the people of Northern Europe looked up at the winter sky and saw a terrifying procession. They believed that during the solstice, the veil between the worlds was at its thinnest. The dead were not gone, they were riding on the storm winds. Led by Odin, the All-Father, or sometimes by a spectral variation of Herod or a pagan goddess, this ghostly cavalcade would tear across the night sky. To see the wild hunt was an omen of war, plague, or death. The howling of the wind down the chimney was not weather, it was the baying of spectral hounds. The offerings left out, bread, ale, the last sheaf of grain, were not cookies for a jolly elf. They were bribes. You left food out to appease the dead, to keep the hunt from landing on your roof and taking your soul to join their eternal ride.
This is the true origin of the flying sleigh and the night rider. The church, in its brilliance, did not try to deny that there was a rider in the sky. They simply changed the rider's name. They took the terrifying, one-eyed Odin with his long white beard and his eight-legged horse Sleipnir, and they softened his edges. They replaced the spectral hounds with reindeer. They replaced the fear of abduction with the joy of gift-giving. But the archetype remains. The figure of the bearded wanderer coming from the frozen north, entering through the chimney, the symbolic portal between the spirit world and the domestic world, is a direct continuation of the shamanic traditions of the lost tribes of Europe. However, the co-opting of these myths was not a clean surgery. It left scars. The fear of the dark time never truly left the holiday. It just went underground. We tell ghost stories at Christmas, think of A Christmas Carol, not because it is a quirk of Victorian literature, but because the solstice has always been a festival of the dead. The Christmas spirit was originally exactly that, a spirit, a ghost. When we look at the nativity story itself, we see how these ancient currents influence the narrative we know today. The presence of the Magi, the three wise men, is the bridge between the forbidden myths of the East and the new religion of the West. These were not kings in the traditional sense. The term Magi refers to the Zoroastrian priest caste of ancient Persia. They were astrologers, dream interpreters, and magicians. The root of the word magic comes from their title. By including the Magi in the Christmas narrative, the early storytellers were making a powerful statement. They were claiming that the masters of the old wisdom, the keepers of the star charts and the forbidden knowledge of the East, were bowing to the new power. It was a theological coup, but it also injected a stream of high strangeness into the story. These men followed a star, an astronomical anomaly that has puzzled historians for 2 millennia. Was it a comet, a supernova, a planetary conjunction, or was it, as the Gnostic texts suggest, an angel in the guise of a star, a sentient guide leading the old world to its end? The gifts they brought, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, were not random birthday presents. They were ritualistic tools. Gold for a king, frankincense for a deity, and myrrh? Myrrh was a resin used in embalming. It was a perfume for the dead. Even at the cradle, the shadow of the tomb was present. The Magi knew what they were visiting. They were acknowledging that this child was born to die, a sacrifice prepared from the moment of birth. This connects us back to the most ancient of solstice traditions, the blood sacrifice. In the pre-Christian world, the return of the sun required a price. The Yule boar was sacrificed to Freyr to ensure a good harvest. The blood was sprinkled on the walls of the temples. We still eat ham at Christmas today, a culinary echo of that ritual slaughter. The church replaced the blood of the boar with the wine of the Eucharist, but the underlying logic remained the same. Life cannot continue without a death to pay for it. The sun will not return unless it is bought. As the centuries ground on, these jagged edges were smoothed down. The terrifying Perchta became the fairy godmother. The wild hunt became a delivery service. The embalming spice became a symbol of bitterness. But the DNA of the holiday is stubborn. You can feel it when the lights go out. You can feel it in the strange melancholy that often accompanies the season, a primal memory of the long dark. We are still lighting fires against the night, huddled together in the cave, hoping that the sun will remember to rise one more time. The rituals have changed, but the fear and the hope remains exactly the same. But if we dig deeper, past the snow-covered forests of northern Europe and the iron-gray skies of the Germanic tribes, we strike bedrock in the cradle of civilization itself. Long before the Norsemen feared the wolf, and long before the Romans crowned their Saturnalia king, the ancient Babylonians were enacting a ritual that would haunt the human subconscious for millennia. They called it Zagmuk. This was not merely a festival.
It was a cosmic necessity, a desperate metaphysical war waged to keep the universe from unraveling. In the dust and heat of Mesopotamia, the new year did not begin with a ball drop. The Babylonians believed that at the winter solstice, the supreme god Marduk had to engage in combat with Tiamat, the primordial dragon of chaos. This was the moment the world held its breath. If Marduk failed, the sun would not just fade. Reality itself would dissolve into a formless void. To ensure his victory, the civilization on Earth had to mirror the struggle in the heavens. But here is where the myth turns dark, revealing the forbidden architecture of our holiday traditions. The king of Babylon, the absolute ruler, had to be stripped of his power. He was humiliated, slapped by the high priest until he wept, and forced to kneel. If the king did not cry, it was a bad omen, a sign that Marduk might fall. But the city could not be left without a ruler while the true king was abased. So they chose a substitute, a mock king. Usually a criminal or a prisoner of war, this man was dressed in royal robes, given the king's scepter, and allowed to indulge in every vice and luxury the palace could offer. For a few days, he was the master of the world. He ate the finest food, drank the rarest wines, and slept with the king's concubines. It was a time of total inversion, a brief window where the laws of man were suspended. But the bill always comes due. At the festival's climax, the mock king was not thanked for his service. He was stripped, beaten, and ritually sacrificed. His throat was slit to feed the earth, his blood serving as the fuel that allowed Marduk to defeat the Chaos Dragon. The true king was then restored, his reign washed clean by the blood of the substitute. This is the terrifying ancestor of the Lord of Misrule, a tradition that survived well into medieval Christmas celebrations, where a peasant would be crowned to lead the revelry. We have sanitized it now, turning it into paper crowns and Christmas crackers. But the origin is soaked in the blood of a man who was treated like a god only so he could be slaughtered like a beast. Travel forward from Babylon, and you find this obsession with the unconquered sun taking a different, more secretive form in the heart of the Roman Empire. While the masses celebrated Saturnalia in the streets, a different kind of worship was happening underground, literally. Beneath the bustling cities, in windowless, cave-like temples called Mithraea, Roman soldiers and elites gathered to worship Mithras. This is perhaps the most potent lost civilization narrative within the Christmas story, the religion that almost won. Mithras was a solar deity, often conflated with Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. His mythology is startlingly familiar. He was said to have been born from a rock, fully formed, a miraculous birth witnessed only by shepherds. His followers called him the light of the world. They shared a communal meal of bread and wine in remembrance of him. And his birthday? It was celebrated on December 25th, the Natalis Invicti. The cult of Mithras was a mystery religion, sealed by oaths of silence and terrifying initiation rites. Initiates had to descend into these subterranean chambers, which were designed to look like the cosmos, lined with symbols of the zodiac. There, surrounded by darkness, they would witness the central icon of their faith, Mithras slaying the celestial bull. It was a religion of masculine force, discipline, and salvation through blood. For centuries, Mithras was Christ's greatest rival. There are historians who suggest that if a few battles had gone differently, or if the Emperor Constantine had seen a different vision in the sky, we might be celebrating the birth of Mithras today, eating bread in dark caves rather than singing carols in wooden pews. The early church fathers were so disturbed by the similarities that they claimed the devil had traveled back in time to create the cult of Mithras specifically to confuse future Christians. They couldn't accept that the archetype of the solar savior born at the solstice was not unique, but a universal human projection. But let us step away from the rivals of Christianity and look at the nativity story itself through the lens of dark folklore. The version we tell children is a pastoral idyll, quiet, peaceful, filled with adoration. But the text itself and the apocryphal legends surrounding it paint a picture of high-stakes cosmic horror. Consider the Magi. We call them wise men or kings to soften their image. But the Greek word used in the Gospel is magoi. These were not monarchs. They were Zoroastrian priests, astrologers, and practitioners of what we would call sorcery. They were wizards. In the ancient world, the arrival of Persian Magi was not a whimsical visit. It was a diplomatic and spiritual crisis. They were experts in reading the movements of the stars, which they believed dictated the rise and fall of empires. When they saw the Star of Bethlehem, they weren't looking at a pretty light. In the astrological language of the time, a new star, a nova, or a planetary conjunction signaled the death of a king and the birth of a usurper. They were tracking a regicidal event. They traveled for months, crossing hostile deserts, not to give gifts to a baby, but to locate the epicenter of a supernatural upheaval that threatened the existing order of the world. Their gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, were prophetic markers. Gold for a king, yes, frankincense for a priest. But myrrh? Myrrh was an embalming spice. It was used to mask the stench of decaying flesh. It was a gift for a corpse. From the moment he drew breath, the shadow of death was laid in the cradle beside him. And this brings us to the darkest chapter of the Christmas narrative, the one we conveniently omit from the pageants, the Massacre of the Innocents. The story tells us that King Herod, paranoid and terrified by the Magi's prophecy of a new king of the Jews, ordered the execution of every male child in Bethlehem under the age of 2. This is the blood price of the holiday. While the Holy Family escapes into Egypt, guided by divine warning, the screams of slaughtered children echo through the streets of Judea. In the folklore of the region, this event left a psychic scar on the land. It aligns with the ancient pattern we saw in Babylon. The birth of the new order requires a sacrifice. The old king, Herod, tries to devour the young king, Jesus, and in the process, the blood of the innocent is spilled. It is a moment of pure horror. Soldiers breaking down doors, mothers weeping, the snow, if there was snow, stained red. This is the silent partner to the silent night. You cannot have the miracle without the massacre. The light of the star shines brighter because it hangs over a landscape of grief. This duality is the engine of the solstice. The light is born, but the darkness fights back. In the forgotten corners of Christian mythology, there are legends that the demons of hell were particularly active on Christmas Eve, furious at the birth of their adversary. It was believed that for 1 hour on Christmas Eve, the gates of hell would stand open, and any human unfortunate enough to die at that moment would be dragged straight down regardless of their sins. This is why the bells were rung, not just to celebrate, but to drive back the encroaching spirits with holy sound. The atmosphere of the season, stripped of its modern commercial gloss, is one of spiritual warfare. We are not just celebrating a birthday, we are commemorating a celestial invasion, a moment when the divine broke into a quarantined reality and the shockwaves shattered the status quo. And that shattered status quo rippled outward, far beyond the borders of Judea, alerting watchers who had been scanning the horizons for centuries. This brings us to the most enigmatic figures of the nativity narrative, characters who have been sanitized by Christmas cards into benevolent, crown-wearing monarchs on camels. But if we strip away the pageantry and return to the historical and linguistic roots of the text, the 3 wise men transform into something far more unsettling. They were not kings, they were magi. The word itself, magoi, in the Greek, is the etymological root of our modern word magic, but in the ancient world, it carried a specific heavy weight. These were likely Zoroastrian priests from the Parthian Empire, the great rival to Rome in the East. They were practitioners of a discipline that blended astronomy, dream interpretation, and ritual sorcery. They were the inheritors of the Babylonian mystery schools, men who claimed to read the handwriting of God in the alignment of the spheres. To the Jewish people of the time, the Magi represented a forbidden knowledge, a connection to the occult practices of the nations that had once enslaved them. Their arrival in Jerusalem was not merely a diplomatic visit, it was a collision of cosmologies. Imagine the scene through the lens of history rather than folklore. A retinue of foreign sorcerers arrives from the east, crossing the harsh Arabian desert, bypassing the Roman garrisons. They walk directly into the court of Herod the Great, a paranoid, homicidal tyrant, and ask with terrifying calmness where the real king of the Jews has been born. This was not a polite inquiry, it was a political death threat delivered by mystics. They were following a star, but in the ancient Near East, stars were often synonymous with angelic powers or divine principalities. A star that moves, stops, and hovers is not an astronomical object. In the language of mythology, it is a sentient guide, a luminous entity leading these practitioners of the old arts to the epicenter of a new age.
The gifts they brought, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, further deepen the shadow over the manger. While gold speaks of kingship and frankincense of divinity, myrrh is the outlier. It is a resin used primarily for embalming. It is the perfume of the grave. In the symbolic language of the ancient world, the Magi were not just celebrating a birth, they were preparing a body for burial. They recognized, through their star charts and prophecies, that this child was born to die. The shadow of the cross was cast across the cradle before the infant had even spoken a word. This was the dark wisdom of the Magi, the acknowledgement that this miraculous arrival was inextricably bound to a sacrificial exit. But the canonical Bible is not the only source that speaks of this night. If we venture into the forbidden territory of the Apocrypha, the ancient texts excluded from the final cut of the New Testament, we find a version of Christmas that is far more visceral, strange, and terrifying. The Proto-Evangelium of James, a text dating back to the 2nd century, describes the birth not in a wooden stable, but in a dark cave, a grotto carved into the living rock. In ancient mythology, the cave is a chthonic space, a womb of the earth, often associated with the underworld and the mysteries of life and death. In this account, Joseph leaves Mary in the cave to find a midwife. When he returns with a woman named Salome and another named Salome, time itself seems to fracture. The text describes a moment where the birds stopped in mid-flight. The workers eating from a bowl froze with their hands halfway to their mouths, and the rushing river halted its flow. The cosmos held its breath. When the midwife enters the cave, she is confronted by a cloud of light so intense it cannot be looked upon. As the light recedes, the infant appears. But the narrative takes a turn into body horror when Salome, doubting the virgin birth, attempts to physically examine Mary. Her hand instantly withers, consumed by fire, turning to ash and bone as punishment for her disbelief. It is only when she touches the infant that her limb is restored. This is not the silent, peaceful night of the hymns. This is a terrifying encounter with a power so raw it can dismantle human flesh in an instant. This version of the story, suppressed for centuries, aligns more closely with the ancient view of the holy. Holiness was not just purity, it was radioactive, it was dangerous. To be in the presence of the divine was to risk annihilation. The cave of the Nativity was a reactor core of spiritual power, and those who entered it unprepared paid a physical price.
As this power manifested in the cave, legends tell us that the old world began to crack. There is a profound and melancholic tradition recorded by the historian Plutarch concerning the death of Pan. The story goes that during the reign of Tiberius, roughly the time frame of Christ's life, a sailor named Famus was navigating near the Paxi Islands when he heard a booming, spectral voice from the shore commanding him, "When you arrive at Palodes, take care to make it known that the great Pan is dead." When he delivered the message, a collective groan of lamentation rose from the land, a sound of non-human grief echoing from the forests and the mountains. Christian folklorists later seized upon this legend, interpreting it as the exact moment of the Nativity. Pan, the goat-footed god of the wild, represented the chaotic, primal energies of the pagan world. His death signified the exorcism of the old gods. The birth of the new divinity was the death knell for the ancient pantheons. The oracles fell silent. The spirits that had inhabited the trees, the rivers, and the statues were evicted from their dwellings. The peace on earth was the silence of a battlefield after the opposing army has been routed. This connects back to the concept of the harrowing. The arrival of this child was an invasion that displaced the spiritual squatters of the ancient world. The dark legends of Christmas suggest that the entities displaced did not go quietly. They raged. This is why the season is haunted. It is the anniversary of an eviction. The folklore of the Christmas monsters, the Krampus, the Kalikansaroi, the Perchta, can be seen as the cultural memory of these displaced spirits, the remnants of the old order lashing out against the light that burned them away. We often view history as a linear progression, but the folklore of the Nativity presents it as a violent rupture. The lost civilization in this context is the spiritual architecture of antiquity itself. The world before that night in Bethlehem operated under different rules, governed by different powers, subject to the whims of capricious deities and elemental forces. When the stars stopped over the cave, that civilization ended. We are living in the ruins of the old world, building our holidays on top of the rubble of forgotten temples. Yet, the most disturbing implication of these forbidden myths is not about what died, but what survived. The Magi returned to their country by another way, warned in a dream to avoid Herod. They slipped back into the shadows of history, taking their esoteric knowledge with them. The text says they departed, but it does not say they abandoned their watch. They left us with the question: if the stars aligned once to herald an entry, will they align again to signal an end? The cycle of the solstice is eternal. Darkness, light, darkness again. The narrative of the flight into Egypt, which follows the departure of the Magi, reinforces this idea of a world hostile to the divine. Joseph is warned to flee, for Herod seeks the child's life. They escape into Egypt, the land of the pyramids, the necropolises, the ancient magic that once challenged Moses. There are apocryphal legends of this journey too, stories of palm trees bowing down to offer fruit to the Holy Family, and of pagan idols shattering spontaneously as the infant passed by their temples. It is a picture of a refugee god moving through enemy territory, deconstructing the landscape of idolatry simply by being present. But beneath the triumph of these legends lies a persistent, uneasy undercurrent. The massacre of the innocents, the slaughter of the children in Bethlehem, remains the bloody footprint of the story. It is the collateral damage of the incarnation. The forbidden myths do not shy away from this. In fact, they lean into it. They suggest that the spiritual warfare sparked by the Nativity was not a bloodless coup. It was a revolution that carried a heavy cost, a cost paid in human sorrow. The peace on earth promised by the angels was not a ceasefire, but a declaration of a new kind of kingdom, one that would be built amidst the wreckage of the old. And if the earth shuddered at the arrival of this new kingdom, the heavens were already screaming it. To understand the true weight of this event, we must look up, away from the blood-stained soil of Bethlehem and into the obsidian void of the night sky. In the sanitized version of the story, a polite star twinkles gently over a stable, acting like a celestial nightlight for a pastoral scene. But in the context of ancient cosmology and lost astrological traditions, the appearance of the Star of Bethlehem was not a comforting sign. It was a terrifying anomaly, a tear in the fabric of the predictable cosmos that signaled the breaking of an age. To the ancients, the stars were not merely balls of burning gas. They were the ruling powers, the cosmic authorities that dictated the fate of empires. A new star was not a greeting card. It was an omen of regime change, a signal that the celestial machinery had shifted gears to grind the current order into dust. This brings us to the mysterious travelers who track this anomaly, the Magi. History has softened them into three benevolent kings atop camels adorning Christmas cards with colorful robes. But the forbidden myths paint a darker, more formidable picture. The term Magi refers to a specific caste of Zoroastrian priest astrologers from the Parthian Empire, the great rival to Rome in the East. These were not mere stargazers. They were kingmakers, master practitioners of magia, the root of our word magic, and advisors who held the power to crown or depose monarchs. They were steeped in the lost wisdom of Babylon, inheritors of the prophetic timelines laid down centuries prior by the Hebrew exile Daniel, who had risen to become the master of the magicians in the Babylonian court. They were watching the sky because they were waiting for a specific signal, a mathematical convergence that had been ticking down for 600 years. When they saw the sign, they did not travel alone. A journey from the east to Jerusalem was fraught with banditry and peril. These high-ranking officials would have traveled with a heavily armed cavalry escort, a small army that turned their pilgrimage into a diplomatic incursion. This explains the reaction of King Herod and all of Jerusalem. The text says they were troubled, but the Greek implies a deep, visceral agitation, the kind of panic felt when a rival superpower's elite agents appear on your doorstep asking to see the real king. The Magi walked into the palace of a paranoid, murderous tyrant and essentially asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? Because according to the stars, your time is up." This was not a courtesy call. It was a reading of the Cosmic Riot Act. The nature of the star itself remains one of the most debated aspects of the forbidden lore. Astronomers have long sought to align the narrative with the great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in 7 BC, or perhaps a supernova in the Andromeda galaxy. The conjunction theory holds weight in the realm of mythic storytelling. Jupiter, the king planet, circling Saturn, the protector of the Jews, within the constellation of Pisces, the sign of the last days. To a magus reading the sky, this was a billboard written in fire, declaring that the king of the final days had arrived. It was a celestial alignment so rare, so mathematically precise, that it suggested the universe itself was a clock built solely to strike this specific hour.
However, the ancient texts hint at something far stranger than a planetary alignment. The narrative describes the star moving, leading the men, and finally standing over the place where the child lay. Celestial bodies do not behave this way. They do not stop over specific houses. This detail has led theologians and French historians to suggest that the star was not a physical object at all, but a manifestation of the Shekinah glory, the visible presence of God that once led the Israelites through the wilderness as a pillar of fire. In the apocryphal traditions, this light is described as sentient, a living luminosity that acted as a guide. It suggests that the barrier between the material and the spiritual had thinned so aggressively that the angelic realm was bleeding through into the visible spectrum. The star was a rupture, a glowing wound in the sky through which the divine was pouring into the mundane. And what of the gifts they brought? Even here, the shadow of death looms over the cradle. Gold for a king, an acknowledgement of his sovereignty. Frankincense for a priest, used in the temple rituals to carry prayers to heaven. But then there is myrrh. Myrrh is an aromatic resin, yes, but in the ancient world it had a primary grim function. It was an embalming spice. It was used to prepare bodies for the grave. To present myrrh to a newborn is a shocking, almost macabre gesture. It would be like bringing a coffin to a baby shower. The Magi, in their ancient wisdom, understood something that the rest of the world had missed. They knew that this king was born to die. The shadow of his future sacrifice was already being cast over the manger. They were anointing him for his burial before he had even learned to walk. This duality, the glory of the star and the bitterness of the myrrh, captures the true essence of the event. It was a moment of supreme cosmic tension. The arrival of the Magi validated the child not just as a local messiah, but as a universal figure whose birth had been written in the stars since the dawn of time. Yet, their presence also triggered the slaughter of the innocents and signaled the inevitable conflict with the ruling powers of the age. The peace of this night was the eye of a hurricane.
The legend suggests that Herod's terror wasn't just political, it was spiritual. Herod was an Edomite, a descendant of Esau, sitting on the throne of Jacob. He was a usurper, maintained by Roman steel and dark compromises. When the Magi arrived, bearing the weight of ancient prophecy and the dust of a distant empire, Herod looked into their eyes and saw the end of his line. He consulted his own priests, the scribes who knew the letter of the law but had missed the spirit of the signs. They could quote the prophecy of Micah that the ruler would come from Bethlehem, but they lacked the vision to see the star. This creates a haunting dichotomy. The pagan sorcerers from the east saw the light and followed it, while the religious scholars in Jerusalem sat in darkness, clutching their scrolls, oblivious to the fact that the ink was coming alive just 5 miles down the road. The narrative here descends into a strange, quiet dread. The Magi leave Herod, guided once again by the sentient light. They find the child, likely no longer in a stable but in a house, as months or perhaps a year had passed since the birth. They fall down and worship. This act is significant. These were high-status nobility who did not bow to foreign potentates easily. Their prostration signifies a recognition of a hierarchy that transcended human politics. They emptied their treasures, funding the Holy Family's desperate flight into Egypt, financing the survival of the refugee god. And then, warned in a dream, another intrusion of the supernatural into their sleep, they bypassed Herod and vanished back into the east. They slipped away like ghosts, leaving behind a baffled tyrant and a city on the brink of a massacre. The star faded, the angels withdrew, and the Holy Family fled into the night, leaving the world to grapple with a shift in reality that it could feel but not yet fully understand. The ancient gears had locked into place. The old gods were put on notice. The silent, invisible war for the soul of humanity had moved from the cold regions of the upper atmosphere down into the warm, dusty streets of Judea. But the silence was about to be broken by a scream that would echo through the corridors of time. The departure of the Magi did not bring peace to the palace in Jerusalem. It brought a cold, calculating fury. Herod, the client king who had clawed his way to power through betrayal and bloodshed, realized he had been outmaneuvered. The visitors from the east had not returned to report the child's location. They had vanished, and with them, the opportunity for a surgical strike. Herod's paranoia, always simmering beneath his golden robes, boiled over into a mandate of absolute horror. He could not identify the one threat to his throne, so he resolved to burn the entire haystack to kill the needle. The order went out to his soldiers, a command so vile it remains one of the darkest stains on the tapestry of antiquity. They were to march on Bethlehem and its surrounding districts and extinguish the life of every male child 2 years old and under. This was the slaughter of the innocents. It transforms the nativity narrative from a pastoral scene of wonder into a Gothic nightmare of state-sponsored terror. The soldiers descended upon the sleeping village, not as warriors, but as executioners. The wails that rose from the hill country of Judea that night were the grim fulfillment of the prophet Jeremiah's vision. Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted because they were no more. This was not merely a political purge. It was a ritualistic culling, a frantic attempt by the dark powers behind Herod's throne to snuff out the light before it could fully ignite. The soil of the house of bread was watered with the blood of a generation, a sacrifice demanded by the old world to prevent the birth of the new. But the target was already gone. Under the cover of that same starless night, Joseph had been roused by another intrusion of the divine into his subconscious. The warning was stark: flee. They were moving south, driven by the urgency of survival, tracing the reverse path of their ancestors. It is a supreme irony of the ancient world that the Savior of Israel would find sanctuary in the very land that had once enslaved his people. They fled into Egypt, the cradle of the oldest civilizations, a realm saturated with magic, monumental architecture, and a pantheon of animal-headed gods. As the refugees crossed the border into the land of the Nile, the legends, those forbidden myths often excluded from the sanitized versions of the story, tell us that the spiritual atmosphere of Egypt began to fracture. The apocryphal texts describe strange phenomena attending their arrival. They speak of the Holy Family entering the temples of Hermopolis, and as the child was carried across the threshold, the massive stone idols trembled. Statues of Thoth and Horus, which had stood for millennia, fed by the worship of millions, suddenly cracked and toppled from their pedestals. They shattered against the stone floors without a human hand touching them. The localized gods, the territorial spirits of the Nile, recognized a superior authority. The very presence of the incarnate Word acted like a resonant frequency that the old stone could not withstand. The ancient hierarchy was collapsing in the presence of its architect.
Other traditions from the Coptic memory whisper of the desert itself bending to aid them. We hear of date palms bowing their high fronds to offer fruit to the exhausted mother, and of springs of fresh water bursting forth from the arid sand at the child's command. There are stories of the family encountering bandits on the road, two thieves named Titus and Dumachius, who would, 30 years later, hang on crosses beside that same child on Golgotha. In the folklore, the thief who would later ask for remembrance showed mercy to the refugees in the desert, earning his place in paradise 3 decades before the words were spoken on the hill of the skull. These are the lost threads of destiny, woven in the quiet, desperate years of exile while the tyrant hunted in vain. While the family hid in the shadows of the pyramids, a different kind of silence was spreading across the Mediterranean. This is one of the most fascinating intersections of recorded history and dark folklore. During this era, the Greek historian Plutarch records a bizarre occurrence that signaled a cosmic shift. A ship sailing near the island of Paxi was hailed by a booming, disembodied voice from the shore, commanding the pilot to carry a message to the mainland. The message consisted of 3 cryptic words: "Great Pan is dead." When the pilot shouted the news toward the land, a chorus of wailing and lamentation was heard from the invisible inhabitants of the forest. Pan was the god of the wild, the symbol of the pagan world's connection to chaotic nature and primal forces. His death signified the end of an age. The oracles began to fail. The Pythoness at Delphi, who had guided empires with her trance-induced riddles, found her connection severed. The old spirits were retreating, their voices drowned out by the singular event occurring in the Levant. The world was being reordered from the top down. Back in Judea, the architect of the massacre was meeting his own grisly end. Herod the Great did not die peacefully in his sleep. Josephus describes his final days with clinical horror, a rotting of the body from the inside out, a burning fever, and a madness that consumed him. It was as if the corruption of his soul had finally manifested in his flesh. He died in agony, loathed by his subjects and feared by his own family. With the tyrant's breath extinguished, the angel appeared once more in the dreamscape of Joseph. The coast was clear. The hunter was dead. The return journey was cautious. They did not go back to Bethlehem, where the trauma of the slaughter still hung heavy in the air like a fog. They bypassed the center of power in Jerusalem, where Herod's son Archelaus was proving to be just as cruel as his father. Instead, they withdrew to the north, to the rugged, obscure hills of Galilee, to a town called Nazareth. We must understand the nature of Nazareth to grasp the subversive brilliance of this hiding place. It was a settlement of no repute, a hamlet of perhaps 200 to 400 people carved into the limestone ridges, far from the trade routes and the centers of learning. It was so insignificant that it is not mentioned in the Old Testament, the Talmud, or the writings of Josephus. To be from Nazareth was to be a nobody. "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" was a common proverb of the time, a sneer directed at the unrefined hill country. And yet, this is where the myth weaver hid the masterpiece. The king of the universe grew up amidst sawdust and stone chips, speaking an Aramaic dialect with a thick country accent, utterly invisible to the powers that watched the world. For decades, there was silence. No miracles, no sermons, no lightning bolts, just the rhythmic rasp of a plane on wood and the quiet life of a village artisan. This period, often called the hidden years, is perhaps the most mysterious of all. The ancient texts are largely silent here, leaving us with a void that imagination struggles to fill. But in the context of lost civilizations and forbidden knowledge, this silence is heavy with strategy. It was a period of incubation. The deity was learning what it meant to be human, to sweat, to bleed, to hunger, to grieve. The cosmic warrior who had displaced the stars was now learning to build tables and repair plows. This obscurity was the final camouflage. The dark powers that ruled the age, the principalities that had sought to kill him in the cradle, lost his scent. They looked for a prince in a palace, a general in a fortress, or a mystic in the desert. They did not look for a carpenter in a forgotten hill town. The strategy was absolute stealth. The seed had been planted in the soil of humanity, and it was left to germinate in the dark, deep underground, preparing for the moment when it would burst forth and shatter the bedrock of history. The stage was set for the final confrontation, not with armies or swords, but with a message that would dismantle the ancient world brick by brick. The long silence of Nazareth was merely the deep breath before the shout that would wake the dead. And then the breath was released. The silence of Nazareth was shattered not by a trumpet blast from the clouds, but by the sound of water breaking in the Jordan River. When the carpenter stepped into that muddy current, the camouflage was stripped away. The ancient texts say the heavens themselves were torn open, a violent, visceral rending of the barrier between the seen and the unseen. This was the moment the sleeper agent awoke. This was the activation of the weapon. The stealth mission had officially transitioned into open insurrection. From the shadows of the unseen realm, the Watchers must have recoiled in horror. The entity they had hunted, the anomaly they had sought to extinguish in Bethlehem, was suddenly standing in the open, fully grown, and wielding an authority that made the very atoms of the physical world tremble. The war was no longer cold, it was scorching hot. For 3 years, the landscape of Judea became a battlefield of a kind history had never recorded. We often view the miracles through a lens of sentimental charity, but in the context of this cosmic invasion, they were acts of military aggression against the entropy of the fallen world. Every time a blind eye was opened, it was a direct assault on the darkness that claimed ownership of human biology. Every time a storm was silenced with a word, it was a reassertion of command over the elemental chaos. Every time a demon was cast out, shrieking and bargaining, it was a territorial eviction. The dark principalities were being pushed back, foot by foot, their strongholds raided, their captives released. The kingdom of the invader was not a distant promise, it was a crashing wave of new reality, overriding the code of the old world. The powers that ruled the age, the unseen puppet masters behind the thrones of Rome and the altars of the dark gods, realized too late that they were losing control. Panic set in. They conspired to do the only thing they knew how to do: destroy the vessel. They maneuvered the political and religious machinery of the time to crush this insurrectionist. They thought they were the hunters, closing a trap around a radical preacher. They did not understand that they were the prey, and that the trap had been set for them before the foundation of the world. The culmination of this war took place on a skull-shaped hill outside Jerusalem.
It was a place of death, a jagged scar on the landscape where the empire displayed its cruelty. To the human eye, it was an execution, a failed revolution ending in blood and wood. But to the spiritual eye, it was a collision of dimensions. As the nails were driven home, the dark powers gathered, swarming the hill, celebrating their apparent victory. They believed they had finally cornered the invader, pinning him to the earth he sought to reclaim, silencing the voice that had terrified them. But the ancient lore suggests a deeper magic was at work. The death of the innocent was not a defeat, it was the breaking of a seal. The shedding of that specific blood, the blood of the hybrid God-man, did something to the metaphysical fabric of the universe that could never be undone. It was a poison to the old order. By killing him, they allowed him to enter the one place they thought was secure, the realm of the dead itself. This is the part of the story often whispered in the apocryphal legends, the harrowing. For 3 days, while his body lay cold in a stone tomb, the entity was not dormant. He had descended into the abyss, not as a prisoner, but as a conqueror. He kicked down the gates of bronze and shattered the bars of iron. He marched into the deepest dungeons of the spiritual underworld and stripped the ancient overlords of their keys. The grave, which had been the ultimate weapon of the dark gods, the final silencer of all human hope, was looted. The mechanism of death was dismantled from the inside out. When the stone rolled away on that Sunday morning, it was the shockwave of a nuclear detonation in the spiritual realm. The invader returned, not as a survivor, but as the new master of both life and death. The incubation was complete. The seed that had fallen into the ground had not just sprouted, it had become a tree that filled the sky. The aftermath of this event was the slow, agonizing death of the ancient gods. It is a curious historical footnote that around this exact time, the great oracles of the ancient world began to fall silent. The oracle at Delphi, which had whispered the will of Apollo to kings for centuries, sputtered and died. The historian Plutarch records a strange story from the reign of Tiberius, the very emperor on the throne during the crucifixion. A ship pilot named Thamus heard a booming voice across the water instructing him to cry out to the shore that the great Pan is dead. When he did, a collective groan rose from the land, a sound of lamentation from the spirits of the woods and the waters. The old enchantments were breaking. The atmosphere of the world had changed. The dominion of the territorial spirits was shattered, and the vacuum was filled by the spirit of the invader. So, what really happened on Christmas 2,000 years ago? It was not merely the birth of a baby. It was the arrival of a titan. It was the moment the Creator slipped behind enemy lines to sabotage the machinery of despair. It was D-Day. The manger was the beachhead. The cross was the heavy artillery. The empty tomb was the flag raised over the conquered capital. We live now in the occupied territory of the new kingdom. The war is won, though the skirmishes continue. The ghosts of the old gods still haunt the periphery, trying to whisper us back into fear, trying to convince us that the dark is still in charge. But they are merely echoes. The heavy lifting was done in the silence of Nazareth and the darkness of Golgotha. When you look at the nativity scene now, the quiet animals, the shining star, the sleeping child, do not be deceived by the peace of the image. You are looking at the most dangerous object in history. You are looking at the disruption of the cosmos. You are looking at the beginning of the end for everything that hates humanity. The myth became fact, the legend became history, and the world has never and will never be the same. The invasion is complete. The king has landed, and the long winter of the human soul is finally over.